what is or are the most pivotal discoveries coming from study of sea otters in California specifically?
So, I think there were 4 general points that I think were pivotal or landmark or really important to the way things subsequently unfolded. The first was tagging. Just simply tagging. Once it was discovered that you could put a tag on an otter and recite and identify that animal, it changed the world entirely. For everybody, not just California, but everybody working on sea otters. It gave us a means of gathering longitudinal data that we'd never had. It was always snapshot cross-sectional data from populations before that. That was largely due to the efforts of 2 people, Ron Jameson and Jack Ames. Those 2 people, really kind of pioneered and worked at, and there were a lot of things that followed, and there was a lot of criticism of the limitations of the data, the visual data from tag reciting, but just being able to recognize individuals completely opened a whole new realm of understanding that would have never been there otherwise. So to me, that was probably the most important thing that was ever done, just as simple as that. Mm-hmm. From that came what I would say is the next most, another fundamentally important discovery, and that was the discovery of individuality. Our view and most people's view of wildlife and populations was based on the assumption of homogeneity, that they're just individuals, similar individuals in a population, and tagging is what provided the means of recognizing that that was absolutely not true. So really where that started to take form was way back in the, actually before tagging, it was way back in the 70s and early 80s when I was gathering foraging data on otters from 2 Aleutian islands. One was Attu and the other was Amchitka. Ansel Johnson was doing the same thing in Prince William Sound, comparing otters from recently invaded places to long established places. Sheep Bay and Green Island were the 2 places he worked on. And then Ron Jameson was doing the same thing in California, looking at Point Bouchon and someplace in the center, the periphery of the range, and trying to gauge how diet and foraging behavior and foraging economics was influenced by the approach of a population to carrying capacity or resource limitation. That's what that was all about. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that came out of the analysis was that most of the variation that we saw, that we could attribute just in a statistical sense, came from foraging bouts. So that's where almost all the variation in the data came from. It didn't occur to me what that meant until later, but those foraging bouts de facto were samples of different individuals. And so therefore that was actually an individual effect. It wasn't a foraging bout effect. So that's where it all started. Then once we had tags on animals in Central California, people began accumulating data from known individuals, and the first person to do that was Kathy Lyons in her master's work. She went down there and started watching these things. This was before Michelle and Marianne came onto the scene and discovered that certain individuals were very different from certain other individuals. And then that all kind of came together with comparable data from the work that was done at the aquarium, and that resulted in our initial paper on individuality, and then subsequently the more detailed work that's been done on that. So that is a dimension to natural history and behavior that resulted from tagging that I think was probably the next major contribution to the science of sea otters in California, individuality. Mm-hmm. The third major thing, I think, was our understanding and the progression of our understanding of population regulation. And just as sort of a brief recounting of the history of this, all during the years that I was either working on or running the program, we had a mindset of what was going on in California, and that was that there was some exogenous problem. You know, something was limiting the population. And the reason for that logic was that here we have a population that has open habitat into which it can expand, and every place else that we have seen populations that had open habitat into which they could grow grew like wildfire. You know, in the Aleutians, in Southeast Alaska, in Washington, in British Columbia, they all grew very rapidly. And so it seemed almost beyond question that there was something impinging on the growth rate of this population. It had to be mortality because we knew the reproductive rates were the same everywhere. And therefore, I was sort of encumbered with this notion that the explanation for the understanding of the growth of this population had to be in discovering what was the cause of that mortality. And it could have been disease, or it could have been entanglement, or it could have been a whole bunch of things. But it seemed like there was some added source of mortality that had to be the problem. And all during the years that I ran this program, that was the focus and the purpose of the research and the focus. And it wasn't until Tinker came along, and largely through the efforts of both Tinker and Bodkin discovering the critical natural history, and that was that individuals didn't move very much. You know, he began seeing that from the work they were doing in Prince William Sound, and then putting that together, it finally emerged that the growth characteristics of this population were entirely understandable simply based on the geometry of the shoreline and the behavior of individuals. You did not have to go out and find some reason for them dying, you know. So I spent a lifetime running down the wrong path. And I think that discovery by Tinker and Bodkin, really Bodkin's natural history, Tinker's modeling, putting it all together, still unpublished, was hugely important. Very interesting, very important to sea otters, broadly relevant to anybody else that works on understanding demography and wildlife. Those are probably the three main ones. I think the fourth other really big discovery in the important development has to do with the food web and ecosystem effects of otters. There's been very little important work done in California on that interaction. The most important by far is almost completely unknown to anybody else, but was work that Glenn did when he was working here, and he did what I thought was a fabulously important and creative and insightful study where he went back and got these historical maps of kelp distribution before and after otters had recolonized different stretches of coast, and compared what the kelp canopies looked like before and after, and they were just massive afterwards everywhere. After year after year. It wasn't just one time period where it went from sparse to abundant. So, you know, it was an imperfect record, but it was hugely important in terms of both concept and scale. And so I think Glenn's work convinced me that the otter effect in California, well, is perhaps not as far-reaching as it was in parts of Alaska, was nonetheless really big here. And it kind of ended at that. No one else ever looked at it after that. It just kind of got lost in that. The only other really important development in that arena was Brent Hughes' work in the Elkhorn Slough, where he actually went into a different ecosystem. And I think Brent's work was fabulously good and important and really insightful, and told us that these otters function in massively important and complex ways, not only in kelp forest systems, but in these estuarine systems as well. So those to me are the big ones, you know. I mean, there was a ton of other stuff that was done, but when you just look at the power of the science and how important it is to understanding, not to management, conservation, or any other particular thing, but just to understanding, those to me are the big four things that I would put on top.